have, we don't choose in the sense of making kind of initial or radical decision about. We don't wake up and say, you know, I think today I value freedom, or today, you know, I'm going to value piety. You have particular values because you've grown up with them, you've inculcated them in somebody else, and that person now has them. But they're not things that you simply choose. So it's not the choosing that's the critical thing. I think what's important really is that given that people do have different values, that we find some way of negotiating these differences. So I think the explanation about how you negotiate this is not to say, well, everybody gets to choose which values, because they're not really choosing them, but no one really has some kind of special authority to say that these are the values that are going to hold. And I think the values that will come to be embraced will never be values that are just individually embraced, and so-and-so decides to value this, and so-and-so decides to value that. Because all of these values come into existence and come to have a point as a result of people's interaction. And it'll be very weird to have a society in which each individual has his own personal values. The values that they have are things that they've arrived at because of the fact that they have to associate and engage with other human beings. I mean, if you were Robinson Crusoe, you don't need to have any values. You only need them because there are other people around you. That's what the values pick out. They tell you what it is that you should do in a world of human beings. So many of the things that people, in a sense, accept as values are really going to be the product of compromise. And they themselves will also often be transformed by interaction.
But Prof, moving this to the real world, for example, I mean, there is a lot of social tension that goes on. And some of this social tension is because some citizens' personal values don't align with society's compromise. The compromise of values that society reaches.
Yeah.
So how then should society treat these people who don't necessarily agree with society's compromise of values? So, you know, quote unquote, how should a illiberal society treat those who are liberal, and how should a liberal society treat those who are illiberal?
Okay. So the view that I'm defending about the nature of a good society, which is emphasized its nature as something that transcends different boundaries and involves interaction between many different values. In a sense, it's a kind of liberal society. That's how I would describe it. But it's a society that could also, perhaps even almost necessarily, will include within it many different societies, communities, groups, which are more or less liberal. And I think the attitude of that wider society is liberal to the extent that it says, well, we live and let live. Okay? Those who don't embrace these values but are willing to live peacefully, cooperate with one another in their own terms, we will simply accept. Now, if you're talking about an illiberal society and the attitude that it should take to liberal ones, I think it should also take that same attitude. Now, in that sense, you might say, well, aren't you really just asking it too to become a kind of liberal society? And I think the answer here is yes, but I think it's less of a problem for my version of liberalism than it is, say, for the Rawlsian version of liberalism. Because the version of liberalism I'm presenting is one that says, look, you're liberal if you're prepared to accept people who are different in your midst and cooperate with them, but allow them to go their own way. Okay? That's all you need to do to be a liberal. You don't need to be a deep liberal. Okay? So you can accept in that case, people who are not, as it were, members of the faith, provided that they are willing to respect your own traditions and so on. So a good example of this outlook, although not perfect, say, is the attitude of Islam in one sense, or to take a more real-world case, real-world political case, the case of the Ottoman Empire, which had within it many different political communities which were not Muslim. The empire itself was a Muslim empire. Its attitude towards Christians and Jews was essentially that you paid a slightly higher rate of tax, but you kept to your own traditions and so on. Now, there were many more complications. What happened when, let's say, there was a conflict between a Muslim and a Christian? Well, they had to go to a Muslim court. So it's not as if it's completely the case that the non-Muslim communities could go their own way. But nonetheless, the principle, I think you can see. So to me, that gives you a kind of model that a society that isn't deeply liberal should still adopt. It should adopt this minimal sense of liberalism, which is essentially a recognition of the plurality of values, and then a willingness to tolerate difference and recognize that people live by different traditions. Now, as far as those who are themselves members of the liberal society but not part of the liberal minority, they too may have a concern in this illiberal society because they may want it to be more deeply liberal, but then they then have the responsibility and hopefully the opportunity to try to change that internally. But that may be one of the most difficult things to do.
In the real world, there are sections of humanity which are fundamentally opposed to this idea of toleration.
Yes.
So, of course, there are people who like you said, are somewhat liberal in the sense that although they hold pretty deeply held views, they nevertheless recognize that that there are other deeply held views out there, and they respect those views. But on the other hand, there are people in the world who are willing to wage war on the basis of their own deeply held views, and they are willing to kill other people who don't share the same views. So how should society treat them? I mean, their belief that they can wage war is in itself a belief.
Mm-hmm.
How should society treat these beliefs which are so diametrically opposed to toleration?
Mm-hmm. Well, to the extent that what you're dealing with is their beliefs, the only way I think to deal with it is to engage in conversation and dialogue. Because if they're expressing their beliefs, the only way to address someone's beliefs is to say, let's talk about this, okay, and I see things differently. Now, you've got a different problem if their response is, no, we don't want to engage in this because there's no point, you're simply in the wrong, and we're going to do what we can to transform you, whether by persuasion or by force. Now, in that case, I think you may be pushed to the point where you have to either defend yourself practically or engage in some kind of activity that does more than just talk to people who don't want to engage in any conversation. But in the first instance, I think the only thing you can do is talk. And also, I think, in the end, the only thing you can really do is talk. Because even if you go to war, every war ends. I mean, some of them may take 100 years, but they will end. And they will always end with talking. Because that's how things get settled. Even if you wipe out the other side, to a very substantial degree, you still end up talking. Now, you may say there are a couple of examples that are exceptions to this. The Romans, when they finally beat the Carthaginians, went to Carthage and razed it to the ground and killed everyone. Okay. I mean, that is pretty rare. I mean, most of the time, what happens is that people are trying to convert, transform, not to eliminate, in which case it's always going to end up with some sort of dialogue. And I think that's as much as you can really say, because you can't establish at the outset some set of values or principles that you can say, well, you know, these are the things that have to be appealed to convince people of something, and that's how you will get somewhere, because it almost certainly won't be the case. You only get somewhere by the process of dialogue and interaction and conversation and so on, at the beginning and I think at the end.
What about the case of people who do not have the power to really effect change or really have a say in the compromise of values in society? So we can think of, in the real world, the extreme disadvantage in society. I mean, they necessarily have to live in that society or association or, you know, social body. But because of their disadvantage in society, they may not have as much of a say in the kind of compromise of values that society reaches. So, how do you think? How would you deal with this problem?
Well, for people in those circumstances, I think there are two things that can happen. One is that individuals in that situation can themselves take risks, become politically active, become intellectually and socially active, to try to start movements for change. And I think this has happened. The other thing that can happen, as either as an alternative or simultaneously with this, is that others who share their attitudes, even if they're not members of the same minority, can take up the struggle on behalf of other people. And I think this is not an unusual thing. So to take a couple of examples, struggles for civil rights in the United States did involve many African Americans trying to stand up for their rights, but they were also helped by large numbers of sympathizers from other races who argued for, struggled for a kind of political transformation. And I think there was a lot of success that was won by this, even though for a long, long time these people were, as the descendants of slavery, a very, very embattled and put down minority. You could say a similar thing for gay rights. 50 years ago, the circumstances of gay people was very, very different than it is now. It's not because there was suddenly a greater number of them, but there was enough sympathy among other people for their condition that changes could come about. So I think it's still possible, even if you are in a very small minority.
But these examples that you have suggested are premised on there being a reasonable accessibility to free speech, reasonable accessibility to political participation. But what about the case of a absolute dictatorship where there is no freedom of speech? What about the disadvantage in that society if they don't believe in the same values of absolutist dictatorship that society would, that the rest of that society would even?
I think it just makes it harder. It doesn't make it impossible. And I think one of the reasons why it's not impossible is that it's rare for a society to be completely undivided, in which case it may be possible for those who are in a minority to form alliances with others with similar interests, even though they may also be very, very different, very diverse in other respects. But I don't want to make this sound like in everywhere things are possible. It's not a kind of can-do optimism that I'm preaching. It's much more difficult, for example, I think, to reform certain institutions in a place like Saudi Arabia, than it is to effect, I would think, reform in Indonesia, because you've got a different political structure, you've got a different set of background conditions, and in some places it may just be that the regime is so repressive it makes it very difficult for dissent to become effective. It's hard to see how things will change in North Korea. But even there, I think eventually things will change, because there are people who see that there's something wrong and will have an interest in working towards this. I remember in the 1970s and 80s, people generally thought that the Soviet Union would last for hundreds of years. A few people saw it as something that would collapse, but of course it did. Even though the regime looked like it had a very, very firm grip on the society. Well, I think one doesn't really know, but it would be foolish to say that there are societies where it would be extremely difficult.
So going back to the original theme of liberalism, are these difficult societies, maybe North Korea is too difficult an example, but say for example Saudi Arabia, do you think they are at least minimally liberal in the sense that you just mentioned, that at least the values that are in the society are a product of compromise of values amongst the population, which may nevertheless be subject to some inequalities of bargaining power, but still, they can still be sort of minimally liberal in this sense?
Because I don't really know enough about Saudi Arabia to be confident about what I say there, and the part is I don't know what the divisions are in the society, and also in a society like Saudi Arabia, you've not got a democratic regime in which there are plural interests that express themselves through an open political process. So any change that's going to come about is going to come about, working against a regime that has its own independent source of power and wealth. But that said, I mean, it's also well known that the regime is a very unstable one, because it's one in which there's a great deal of disaffection for all sorts of reasons. So change could come about even in a place like Saudi Arabia. Now, given the events of the last 2 years, one has to point out that this does not necessarily mean that if things, move in a more radical direction, there's more criticism and ultimately a challenge to a regime, that everything will turn out well. So you look at Libya and Syria right now, it looks like a complete disaster. Okay, so it's not the case that just because a liberal regime is challenged, that what you will get is a more liberal, more tolerant, more open kind of outcome. That may not be the case.
But at least in the abstract, can a absolutist dictatorship, which is authoritarian, which severely curtails freedom of speech, severely curtails freedom of political participation, can it be minimally liberal in the sense that you mentioned?
Well, I suppose it depends on how minimal liberalism is. So for me, there has to be a significant toleration for dissent and let's just call it exit from the prevailing norms. That is to say, there must be some possibility that you can carve out a space for yourself to act according to your own norms. It may not be perfect, but there's some space. And I think there are probably quite a few regimes in the world which are not minimally liberal in that sense. But the more liberal you are, the more willing you are to let people find their own way, both individually and collectively.
And about this question of freedom of dissent. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not just limited to the freedom to think differently. It extends to the freedom to actually express a different view to others. And to a certain extent, this may require some resources. Does your requirement of sort of minimal liberalism, not deep liberalism, nevertheless require that individuals be entitled to resources to express their views?
That's a good question, and it puts a view that many liberals have advanced.
And of course, you can. The same applies to exit rights, for example. I mean, in many cases, in the real world, you could say that someone has the freedom and right to exit a country if he doesn't agree with the kind of compromise of values that the country subscribes to, and join a country where its compromise of values is more agreeable to it. But really, that's quite difficult for some people because of the social economic circumstances that's here.
No, you're quite right that we do need resources sometimes to be more effective. And if you haven't got resources, the right to think and act differently may be pretty cheap right. But that said, there is a worry that comes with saying that everybody has some kind of right or entitlement to the resources necessary. Because once you say that, then you've really got to establish what those rights are, what those resources are, and who is responsible for supplying those resources. Now, that puts the whole question of the distribution of resources back into the center, and requires that you establish some kind of authority that is in the business of handing out those resources. In which case, what you then get is people competing for those resources by tailoring their claims to the rules that are now established by the authority that's been established as the entity that's going to settle these sorts of questions. The worry, I think, in all of this is simply that this is making this question determined not by the interaction of groups of people who may transcend different borders and boundaries and so on. What it risks doing is setting up precisely what I said at the beginning I was concerned about, which is something like a closed society in which the division of resources is settled centrally. One of the reasons why you want this freedom of dissent is to challenge the center. But if, whether or not you can have the resources you need is going to be determined by the center, I think you're back with the original problem. The center is going to determine who's going to get the resources. So in that sense, I'd say better to say just take your chances. Okay? Is it that difficult to come up with the resources to challenge authority or to exit or to move or to dissent? I don't think so. I mean, to give you an example, in the case of exit, the world's refugee camps are full of people who are among the poorest. And how have they managed to exit? Well, they find all kinds of ways. Families have pooled their resources to allow the sons to escape, hoping that when the sons escape, they will then find the resources to either return and help the others or send resources to help the others. Or maybe it's just to flee, because in some cases, the Taliban, for example, are targeting young men, so it's important to let them escape. There are all kinds of ways in which people can come up with means and so on. But to take the attitude that, well, everybody's entitled to the means that you've got to establish some kind of mechanism for distributing the means, and then you're going to give power to the center. And that's what you'll be worried about if you want to make sure that dissenters aren't going to be subject to that sort of control and power.
And of course, in this conception of liberalism, the right to exit doesn't necessarily entitle you to a right of entry.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. What is the implication that you want to draw from this?
So, the point that I was making was rather that in this liberal social order, although you may have massive amounts of refugees, the fact that it is liberal doesn't require other states to accept these refugees.
I think it does. Maybe require to be understood in one way rather than another. It means required here suggests not that there's got to be a legal obligation, but rather for such a society to work, it's necessary that there be places that are willing to accept people who want to move into them. So in principle, if you had a world in which other societies were not willing to admit people, then a liberal order would be difficult, not impossible. So for example, supposing the world were divided up not into different jurisdictions, which was, say, for example, geographical, but into different communities that were associated through kinship systems. Well, you could only move, let's say hypothetically, from one group to another if you were in the right kinship network. Well, that might turn out to be a very closed society because in that sort of system, your movement is really curtailed by the fact that if you don't have the right connection, you can't move. So, a system like that, in which human relations were organized in this way, will probably never become a liberal system. It will be one in which people could not really leave one community and enter another. It would also be a system in which people were very unlikely to develop a way of thinking that might lead them to actually move away and form another society altogether. So I think liberalism, in that sense, does require a certain kind of thinking implicit in the views of the population, and the absence of certain kinds of institutions which might make it impossible for people to even conceive of moving.
I'm going to round off the discussion because I think it's definitely time for Q&A already. Prof, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Malaysian context.
A little bit.
Do you think Malaysia ought to be more liberal in the sense that we've just discussed? And what sort of practical kind of changes need to be made?
Okay, maybe I'll say less about the practical changes, but a little bit more about the liberalism. Now, in one sense, it seems to me that Malaysia is naturally a place that should be a liberal society, and is already a place which I think naturally has a great deal of liberalism in it. Because to begin with, it's a society that's very diverse linguistically, culturally, and religiously. And it's also a society that's politically pluralistic. There are lots of different peoples who live in Malaysia. They have lots of different traditions and ways and practices. We've got, apart from the Indians and the Chinese and the Malays, you've also got in Sarawak, Iban and Kerusi, and people of mixed descent. In different parts of the country, you've got all kinds of people. You've got the Nyonya in Malacca, so on. You've got different ways of living, from rural Malays to urban Malays, Indians who've grown up on rubber estates to those who are in the professions. So it's a very, very diverse society. it's also a society that's a very modern one in the sense that it's a society that has a very, very substantial English tradition because of its history of colonization. It's also had long-standing interaction with Europe because of previous colonizers, the Portuguese and the Dutch. It's also been a kind of center for trade because people from China, Japan, to all parts of Europe have found themselves crossing paths at this intersection. So it's a very diverse society, and a society which historically has allowed all of these people to interact, to intermingle, and ultimately to actually form a society on independence. It was a liberal society, and has been, in that sense, a liberal society for most of its existence, both before independence and since. So that, I think, is in a sense the real Malaysian tradition. Now, given that, it's not all that difficult for a society like that. The problem, I think, will come because there are different groups always in any society that want to read some particular view that they favor into the tradition, because there's some particular advantage to them, either because they want to promote some particular value, or I think even more likely because there's some political advantage to be gained by saying, no, this is how you should read the tradition. So I think in Malaysia right now there's a great deal of argument from some sides of politics to say, no, this is actually much more of a non-Western country, a non-liberal country. In some parts even to say it's much more a Muslim country. But if you look at the Constitution, it is a liberal Constitution. It was the Constitution that was established on independence, amended many, many times, but essentially the Constitution that said it is a society of many different races and traditions, and everybody has a place. Well, that's liberalism. Now, you can still debate how much of this you want, in what sense it needs to be modified, but that tradition is a liberal tradition. I think the anti-liberal elements in the society are really going against the history of Malaysia, both as a country and as a region.
Okay. So in that spirit of